I used to love this game. It's a game of world domination, and I quickly found when I joined the military that, like any game, it's based upon what actually happens in the real world. So what we got here, and what I've done a little mock-up just to give you almost like a potted history, if you like. So this was the world after World War II. As we saw here, you had a balance. I used to call it the balance of powers. And during World War II, of course, it was the Axis versus the Allies. And that created this balance, which for the bankers was really, really powerful, because it meant that they could bolster the Nazi Party in Germany and then pay for, through the Lend-Lease agreement, the Russians and the Americans and the British to fight them, and then afterwards creating the Marshall Plan to build up Germany again. And this is what we were left with. So we had two large balance of powers. We had the Western nations with America and Canada and most of Western Europe fronting up to Germany, and with sporadic Western civilizations both in Australia, South Africa, and also down in the southern archipelago of America. And of course all the Reds are the communists, with a large portion of the Chinese. The Bolshevik Revolution had come and brought the Russians in, and of course East Germany and the eastern nations of Bulgaria and Romania and all of those Warsaw Pact nations. Now the black ones here is Islam. So Islam was pretty quiet during the Second World War. They joined various different alliances, but they largely remained in this Northern Africa, Middle Eastern area there. Now, once we started getting into the Cold War, so the Cold War was, from 1945 all the way through to 1990 in the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, what happens when you have a balance of power is that you're still trying to have world domination, but you don't want to actually go for another war. So what happened is that the Russians, with their Trotskyists, their Leninists and their socialist terrorist groups, started creating small links of terrorism. We had Cuba here, we had a lot of Africa going on during the 60s and the 70s, and a lot of these nations, were starting to be subverted into communist or socialist rhetoric. And that is largely how it worked. Throughout the 70s and the 80s, every single terrorist organization was a communist terrorist organization. There were not Islamic terrorist organizations. The nearest that we had was the PLO under Yasser Arafat. Now, once the Berlin Wall collapsed, what happened is that all of these started to go away. So we took away Eastern Germany, we took away Lithuania and Estonia and all that, we took away the Ukraine and Belarus and Georgia, and obviously everything started to move back this way. Cuba stayed there, communist regimes tended to disappear in Africa. And this was largely where it was. So the Western nations started to move up, as we've seen with NATO, and this is one of the reasons that we have the problems with the Ukraine right now. So that is how the balance of power started. So the Russians are where they are right now. They are not strong enough to be able to invade. The Chinese have never shown any real need to invade other countries. So now we have a lack of balance now, because the Russians are powerless to be able to go for world domination. So if you're a banker, if you're a world government, if you're a globalist, you want to increase the level of fear, and that can only be done through uses of terrorist groups. So from 1990 onwards, all of the terrorist groups suddenly, almost overnight, turned into Islamic groups. So we had the Black September, Abu Nidal first off, and then we had Hezbollah, and then it moved on to all of both Iranian-sponsored terrorist groups, Libyan-inspired terrorist groups, and Saudi-inspired terrorist groups. Now, throughout this time, the balance of power started to shift, and the Americans then started to create more wars against specific Islamic nations, and these were what they call the Big Seven. So we had Libya, we had Yemen, we had Lebanon, we had Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course Iran and Syria, all of these are Shia Muslim nations. Now, we've never really had a problem against the Shia, but Saudi Arabia does. So the Wahhabists of Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden was a Wahhabist, they suddenly came to prominence. And when they suddenly came to prominence, we then had the Western nations going into Afghanistan and then starting to go into Iraq as well. So we're starting to see a push by Western nations, Americans coming across and invading foreign lands, which started to create puppet governments. Now, in that moment of what happened there is that you started to see a lot of refugees that were in here, like Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq, starting to populate into Europe. They had nowhere else to go. So they'd come into Italy, they'd come into southern Europe, and they'd come into Spain, and they'd come into Greece, and they're going to Norway, and they started to infiltrate into the UK, certainly into France, as we've seen, France and Belgium. And all of a sudden now, as we can see, is that there's a new balance of power. But the new balance of power isn't geographically separate. When it's geographically separate, you can use, the deterrent of nuclear weapons. When your enemy is actually inside, and of course now we've got Muslim integration, or rather not integration, but immigration into the US as well, and certainly Canada, where they're opening their arms wide to bring them in. So all of a sudden this new balance of power starts to increase the level of fear. And the more Muslims that come into your nation, we now see that it's almost like a disease. It's almost like a cancer that is now coming into the countries, because you can't just fight against like you could the communists. It's very easy just to go west or to go east or either way. That is how conventional wars are fought. This is a war of ideology that's coming up. This is a war of the mind. And the more that we have this immigration of Islamic nations coming through into the West, the problem then is inside our own nation, which increases then, instead of the budgets being used for Trident nuclear deterrence and big battleships and big warplanes, because they're useless in this type of environment. But what we're seeing now is a rapid increase in surveillance, domestic policing, Department of Homeland Security, federalized organizations that are now rallying to take on the perceived threat that was actually introduced in the first place. So what we're going to see with increased immigration from Muslim nations is that their domination, their caliphate, will then start to decrease this. There's been lots of talk about the Russian economy being downgraded. The Chinese are still doing well, but they're faltering as well. So we're starting to see a reduction in the effectiveness of the Russian Federation and the Chinese. They're no longer a threat to us. The big threat now is coming from here. As now we start to see in 2020 to 2030, as Western nations don't breed enough, you're going to start to see more and more Islamics coming in to Germany. And if it's still under a democratic system, they're going to start voting out and voting in Sharia. And you're going to see this in France, you're going to see this in Belgium, certainly you're going to start to see this in the UK as well. So that is eventually how this new integration, this new threat is actually going to be. How do we counter this threat? Do we actually continue this terrorist war, which is a never-ending war? How can you have a war that ends when the enemy is actually inside your country? It's very easy when you take over Germany and the war ends. It's simple. You have a VE day, everyone celebrates and everyone starts to rebuild. You can't do that in this scenario because the fear is always there. So I believe that the globalist powers are introducing this, they're introducing Muslim immigration in order to be able to create the war inside. It's a war of ideology, it's a war of the minds. How are we going to do this? Well, How are we going to solve it? Well, for a start, we can actually stop selling weapons to the Middle East. The thing about Muslim countries is that they don't invent anything. They don't make anything. They don't make any arms, ammunition. They don't make aeroplanes. They don't make cars. They literally do not make anything. They haven't invented anything for nearly 80 years. I think the only thing they've invented is a switch that goes on one of the prayer rugs to wake you up if you fall asleep while praying. That's it. So they require Western nations to give them the technology that will actually allow them to fight the wars that they want to fight. Cut that off and we're done. Cut off the need for oil. What else have they got to offer? Are they going to buy Kalashnikovs with dates and camels? It isn't going to happen. So the only way forward is to ring fence this, is to push everything back to where it was, and because that's where the threat is. You know, you cut out the cancer that's there, so you take out the individual terrorist camps that are currently on US soil. You integrate the Muslims that can be integrated, and you literally get rid of the threat in Europe and start to take back what you had, and let these guys live in peace within their ideology of how they wish to live, and don't go into their country and start bombing it and try and change their lives. You know, all you need to do is to let them have their 15th century viewpoint of the world, and that's fine. Eventually they'll just continue to stay there. What we need to do as a species is that we need to stop war, you know, and stop this glorification of thinking that we're doing the right thing by trying to change everyone to our ideology. So that is how I believe that we must do. If we do not do this, we are going to be in constant war for the next 30 years. That is my prediction. So not fun and laughter, not fluffy bunny, and certainly not sugar coated, but that is what I see as a warrior, as a strategician, and I think it's troubling. So that's Simon Trezelyan. Any questions, just put them on the thread and I'll be delighted to answer them. Bye bye now.